I was thinking about the idea of like how no one text or no one theorist can bear all the weight of your expectations. But then imagine if you're actually getting into bed with the person.
I know.
Like literally, not just like the way we like get into bed with Freud.
There's this anecdote that I love about like Rita Hayworth, and she would say like, after Gilda, she would say, like men go to bed with Gilda and they are disappointed the next morning to wake up with Rita.
Oh.
And it's such a sad anecdote, but like that so often comes up.
Yeah.
Is like, oh God, you're going on a date with Lucie Fielding, author of Transex, and then, you wake up with actual Lucy, and who's messy. So yeah, it's a weird thing to kind of like navigate all of those things. So
in terms of just the comparison that Abby introduced here, namely between your book and your authorship and Freud's work and Freud as an author, if only moving that from the bed to the bookshelf, as it were, I was so struck by reading the two texts alongside one another and in dialogue with one another and in anticipation of our dialogue about those texts by questions of genre notwithstanding, right? Freud is doing all this pathologizing and is doing this kind of developmental account. His audience is much more restricted. The artfulness of your work, its capacity to be both so rigorous and inclusive and accessible and lively and fun and not obviously deformed by hangups in the way that Freud's was just so refreshing and thrown into even sharper contrast while reading his. And I just wanted to commend you on that, because that's such a rare to be both so rigorous and so humane and inclusive, and to think about difficult experiences of trauma and self-formation and how that's expressed in the really complicated world of human sexual interaction without recapitulating or producing new kinds of stigma is just an achievement. And I just wanted to say kudos to you.
Thank you so much. That means so much. And it means, so much coming from you and y'all. I actually, I think about Freud a lot because I kind of see there's like tension in Freud. There are a lot of tensions in Freud, but like one of them that I really note is like the tension between like those moments where he's trying to articulate psychoanalysis as a social science or as a science, and is trying to be legit, and then those times where he just revels in the fact that he likes stories and myths and metaphors, and that he's a literature nerd and a humanist. And I think that's the part of Freud that I tend to take, is like when he's at his most literary and florid in his prose. And, it's like, I love that take, because like, I'm always trying to resist this idea that like psychoanalysis or psychotherapy in general is a social science. I'm a humanist, and my background's in literature and history and, in particular cultural history. And so like, like I love that part of Freud, like the uncanny, Das Unheimliche is such this like gorgeous and weird text, and so relies on him as a literary critic.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was revisiting for our conversation, the three essays on the theory of sexuality. And it reminded me of how infrequently I revisit that text, because it has like, it's so, there's so many moments, and we'll get to this today, and that are so radical and so prescient even, but it's also, it is not that like kind of beautiful literary Freud at all. And I was actually struck as I was opening it up and looking at all of my marginalia. I had like a memory of the number of times that I have had it on a syllabus and I've opened it up and been like, I'm just going to give a little lecture about this because unless you're really prepared to be so generous, there are so many obstacles, I think, for anyone with, what do I want to say? Like contemporary sensibility with respect to issues of gender and sexuality. And yet it has so many resources. It's so far down on my list of books that I will give to people to say, hey, give Freud another shot.
Yeah.
But also I want to have this conversation reading your book, Transsex, next to it, because I think that when we do that, it helps remind us as readers of Freud that there are so many resources there. There are so many productive possibilities that, more than a century later, polymorphous perversity is a great concept to think with.
Yeah. And it becomes liberatory in a really cool way. And I have a quote from Dorothy Allison prepared, on this question, polymorphous perversity, because there's so much there there's so many moments of radicalism in it where, you're almost like cheering Freud on for like departing from Krafft-Ebing, departing from even, like really looking at like Magnus Hirschfeld's work and recognizing how radical that work is.
Yeah.
And so there is that, again, another tension in Freud where there's that permissiveness, while also like then he feels like he has to come around and be prudish about it. It's like that my favorite and episode of Das Unheimlich where he's like circling the red light district, and and it's like he's both like can't not come back to it, but also he's horrified.
I'm really picking up what you're laying down here to the question of like what our go-tos are. I think I may have a different one, but the one I always make a point of getting students to read almost precisely because it speaks to those humanistic kind of capacious dimensions of Freud's sensibilities is this paragraph from Civilization as Discontents, which I think has become justly famous, right? About like where he kind of walks through what I guess we could today call like processes of compulsory heterosexual like normalization and how that involves certain types of exclusion. And it's one of those things that I ask students to read aloud sentence by sentence and then paraphrase it back, because as Freud is going along, you get this remarkable exposure to his style where he's like, just when you think you know what he means, just when you think he's being descriptive, he pulls back and he's actually being normative about how we describe. And just when you think he's describing situations of how things should be vis-a-vis like the optimal sort of like center of the charm circle of this entire process of, I guess, like social reproduction, right? Of the type of sex that is illicit in society. He actually seems to suggest that it doesn't have to be that way, that there are a whole bunch of tremendous exclusions that are preliminary and necessary for that to happen, and that running through it all, and this is the second thing that leaps out from that paragraph, but that also makes me think about your work, and I think is also what we might be able to recuperate from the three essays, among some other things, is this kind of properly normative or at least clinical concern that he shows, where for him, injustice and unhappiness is in depriving people of their capacity for satisfaction. Is of preventing them from, and amazingly he brackets like the question of like constitution or disposition or whatever. It just doesn't matter, born this way or not. It doesn't matter. The point is that we exist under contingent oppressive structures that alienate people from their own bodies and from themselves, and that is wrong. And that's the thing he's the most explicitly normative about in his own voice.
Yeah,
and I'm just like that. He seems to want people to have better sex, like, and that's amazing. 100 years ago.
Yeah. And I kind of also take that from his Judaism as well, which is to say, like with respect to sex in Judaism is that it's supposed to be pleasurable, like that it's not, and it's not supposed to be one-sided, that sex is also just like not strictly copulation for the sake of, preserving the species, kind of thing. And yeah, like, I mean, just the very notion of like talking about the psychosexual stages, I think really does place him in at least an understanding that like pleasure is polymorphous.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Cluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so excited to welcome Lucie Fielding. Lucie Fielding, PhD, LMHC, LPC, is a white, queer, trans-misogyny-affected femme and a therapist licensed in Virginia and Washington State. She received her MA in counseling psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. They also hold a PhD in French from Northwestern University, where she specialized in histories of sexualities and erotic literature. Their background in literature and history attunes them to the many ways that image, metaphor, and cultural scripts shape and inform the narratives we carry with us as we move through the world, as well as how these narratives inscribe themselves on our bodies and form, and inform how we erotically embody. In addition to their work as a therapist, Lucie is a sex and kink educator and a workshop facilitator. She's the author of the book Trans Sex, Nurturing Trans Erotic Embodiment and Gender Pleasure, 2nd edition. The 1st edition of Trans Sex was shortlisted for a 2022 Lambda Literary Award in the transgender nonfiction category and was awarded the 2022 AASECT Book Award, Book for Sexuality Professionals, the 2024 S-Star Health Professionals Book Award, and the 2024 APA Division 44 Distinguished Book Award. We are going to be talking to Lucie today, both about the 2nd edition of Trans Sex, which is out just now and is wonderful, and also dig into certain aspects of Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Lucie, we're so excited to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Longtime listener, first time caller. It is such a pleasure to be sharing space with you and in conversation with you. I love Ordinary Unhappiness so much. And so I'm tickled pink.
Well, we are equally delighted to have you here. I loved the book. I already have different parts of it like mentally bookmarked for different places I want to assign it. So let's get into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, about your work as a therapist and as a writer, and also the many other hats you wear? And about how you came to be interested in psychoanalysis.
So, we're talking about the 3 essays today in part, but I'm also thinking of jokes on their relation to the unconscious, because I think my path, and I don't mean this flippantly, but it'll sound that way. It started as a joke. It started as I was getting a PhD in erotic literature and in French erotic literature. And I would go to these like shitty graduate student parties, like where we were all racing, in a Kafka-esque manner to see, who could get turned into a cockroach first. Mm-hmm. But like, and every single party that I would go to, someone would like ask like, oh, so what do you do? And like I'd tell them, and then unbidden, they would start launching into very intimate details of their sexual and relational lives. And this kept happening. And I would turn to a friend, or later the person who's my nesting partner, and I would say, "Oh my God, why does this keep happening? I should be a sex therapist, and at least I could get paid for this." And for 10 years, it was a joke. It was just something that kept happening. And, as I was an academic, and I did a stint in academic administration and strategic planning and all that kind of stuff. But
the least sexy part of academia, which is saying something.
The least sexy part of academia. But then we were out with my nesting partner and another couple, and they were talking about how there weren't really any sex and relationship therapists in the area where we live. And the car drive home, and this was 2014, I turned to my nesting partner and I said, that joke I used to tell about, I should be a sex therapist? I think I should be a sex therapist. And she said, yeah, and you'll be great at it. And the next day I basically started applying to grad programs, and I started really, and I quit my job in administration and went back to be a counselor and to be a sex therapist. And, and then I'm part of Pacifica is a very, depth psychological, in particular Jungian and post-Jungian kind of framework. And I'm kind of an oppositional character, in that, it's like there was a lot about Jung that I really, and Jungians that I do appreciate and that I do take. But there was also a lot where I was like, oh my God, this is so culturally appropriative. I remember this episode where I was in a Jungian theory class, and and the first day, the instructor puts up on a PowerPoint slide, a picture of a mandala, and then a rose window, and then a medicine wheel. And she was like, these are all mandalas. And I was like, no, these are not all mandalas. That is a rose window. That is a mandala. And that is a medicine wheel. These are all circular shapes. Don't try to archetypal energy this. They have very different use functions. Don't collapse these. And I was in Boston at the time, and there was a really good psychoanalytic institute, and I started taking classes. And in part psychoanalysis, because there's a strain of it, and a very long strain that goes back to Freud, of it being a very literary and critical theoretical apparatus, and hermeneutic, that instantly appealed to me as a humanist. I like to joke that the only kind of CBT that I want, in my vicinity is cock and ball torture. So, and again, it's this feeling of kinship with a love of image and and story and myth and metaphor, whether that's La Planche and the mythosymbolic, or it's analytic field theory and the which I think is just gorgeous, and it's attention to metaphor and how that's playing out, and taking Beyond, which is so not literary, and and then somehow dragging it into a very gorgeous literary way. So I'm a psychoanalysis nerd. It was just that, like, I also started really in earnest. I had for a long time been exploring gender, but I had this moment in my program in the like second term of my program where I started having this dream series. And it was like a 6 dream series. And one of them that I ended up writing down, like, exactly. I never remembered my dreams really before, except for like the nightmares that were really bad. And they started off as like really, really scary. And I ended up using a lot of like Freudian associative techniques, a lot of post-Jungian animating techniques, to kind of like get at, like what's going on here. And what was going on there was like the desire to really fully commit to um, to exploring gender and really leaning into that. And so, like, I'm so grateful to psychoanalysis, and also at that time the Psychoanalytic Institute, and Avgi Sakatopoulou and Pellegrini, talk about this a lot in Gender Without Identity, about just like psychoanalysis and depth psychology have a problem when it comes to like talking about trans experiencing. And so like I somehow just no longer in some ways felt welcome within that kind of culture of the Institute. But it's always stuck with me. It's always stuck with me. And it's all over my work, whether or not I cite it. And I'm also familiar with the limitations of it, as I talk about frequently in my book, but also like concepts in the book, like I talk about a concept called the somatic imaginal, and that wouldn't be a thing without the post-Jungian and the Freudian and the psychoanalytic, and particularly analytic field theory. Without that kind of background, it's there. I can't, just as like my gender journey and my training as a therapist can't be separated. Psychoanalysis cannot be separated from my kind of like formation.
So I want us to talk a little bit about the second edition of your book, which is out now. But just to orient folks a little bit before I ask you to talk about it, let me just read a couple of lines that I think will help give listeners, because the book is out so recently, have a sense of what you're up to. Quote, trans and non-binary folks constantly have to engage in extrapolations and life hacks from cis erotic experiencing, because with very few exceptions, an entire research base and body of work in sex education effectively doesn't imagine us as fully fledged erotic beings that have a right to accurate, comprehensive sexuality education tailored to our needs and our bodies. This book is, in essence, an exercise in flipping this particular script, challenging providers, researchers, and cis folks to perhaps imagine into what it would be to extrapolate a bit from trans experiencing, close quote. So, Lucie, the second edition of Trans Sex is out now. It has a different subtitle. I want to, and I think that's actually important in signaling some of what's new here. So, the new subtitle is Nurturing Trans Erotic Embodiment and Gender Pleasure. And it was previously Clinical Approaches to Transsexualities and Erotic Embodiments, which does have a different ring to it. Mm-hmm. Can you tell our listeners a bit about the book, and also in particular about the centering of the categories of both pleasure and of what you call gender pleasure?
Thank you. And that's one of my favorite passages that you read, because it comes the genesis of the book. And I think a lot of writers, come at this, but they emerge sometimes from rage, from a place of, this is not present. And like, why is this not present?
Yeah.
And I'm so sick and tired of having to do this.
Yeah.
This extrapolating. And, I would say, like, disabled folks have to do this. Queer folks, a lot of queer folks have to do this. There's so many communities that are constantly having to like do these extrapolations. And I think if we're engaging in a pleasure-centered praxis of erotic embodiment, then I think that necessarily in some ways means that you are dissatisfied with what is present and available, at our fingertips. Like, something is not working. And indeed, that's like my own kind of understanding of what gender dysphoria is. Like in the DSM-5, for example, and you can trace the understanding of gender dysphoria that is currently there back through into 19th century sexology, but including some of the pieces of the three essays, that it's normally described as this distress occasioned by an incongruence between one's internal felt sense, what we call identity, and what is the gender that is assumed of us or assigned to us at birth or as we're moving through the world. So identity and expression, basically. And so the whole business of gender affirming care is about fixing a problem that is, addressing the distress, fixing the incongruence. And I think my work, my understanding of gender dysphoria, first of all, is that what if we think of it not as a problem internal to the individual, but a problem in the cultures in which we are moving, and that are constantly trying to thrust gender stories on us, sexual stories on us. Like, what's a good body? What's a bad body? What's good sex? What's bad sex? What's too much sex? Patrick, at one point you mentioned the charm circle, like in Gail Rubin's essay, Thinking Sex, which, is like I'm thinking about here in terms of those kind of normative conceptions of what sex is and what gender is. And that, like, what if dysphoria was, instead of a distress, was instead a feeling of revolt or resistance, a putting up of the hand and saying, no, this doesn't fit me. This story doesn't fit me. You're trying to hang, almost like a projection. You're trying to get me to engage in a projective identification. And I'm going to resist that. And I really think that then opens up so much more space for everything to be not about the resolution of a problem, but about, like, how can we push back against oppression and against the stories that don't serve us, that don't serve us as a society, don't serve us as in the cultures in which we move, don't serve us as individuals within those cultures, within that society. And I think often, and this gets me to gender pleasure, there's this feeling that, whether in the kind of clinical domain, which is so, and here we get into like Foucauldian parlance of the clinical gaze, the gaz médical, the idea that medical and mental health spaces are trained to look for a problem in a set of like diagnostic criteria. And so it's often about, how do we resolve this? How do we present this? How do we prevent this? And then this transfers into the popular imagination of like what it means for trans folks to erotically embody, to engage in sex and play and kink experiences, and that it then has to be about, like we have to resolve gender dysphoria first. And, that's what this whole experience is how do we engage in play without stepping on the landmine that is gender dysphoria? And I want something better for us. I want something different. I want something far more important than our resilience or our survival. I want our thriving. I want everyone's thriving. And so I turn to gender pleasure, which is a construction that I get from another sex educator, Tuck Malloy, and which was present in the first edition. And I just really elaborated on it. And, there are so many terms for this that we have. Trans joy being one of my favorites, but like also gender euphoria being probably the most ubiquitous comment. And this gets me to the kind of, subtitle of the new edition, moving from clinical approaches to nurturing transprotic embodiment and gender pleasure, is that I want to find as many ways possible to take us out of the clinical frame. Because it's so often that we trans folks, queer folks, our experiencing is so often being defined from without. This is what it means to be queer. This is what it means to be trans. And I want it to originate from us, and that we get to decide what being trans is and what gender expansiveness is. And that then allows us to then bring back a lot of ancestral traditions and lineages and to call upon those, because there's such a long history of gender expansiveness, in recorded history and probably beyond that. Just a guess. But like gender pleasure is my effort of saying, like, whether we're using a word like dysphoria or euphoria, the words we use matter. My colleagues in narrative therapy, talk about the fact that the words we use, the metaphors we use, bring forth realities. And the reality, I want us to take care to not bring forward realities that have us in the clinic, but instead realities that have us in the bedroom, in the dungeon, in conversation, in pleasure. And so gender pleasure, I see as like the pleasure one can feel in and with gender or agender that is tied to, either things that are gender relevant to you or feeling affirmed in social, sensual, sexual experiences, which goes far beyond pronouns, goes far beyond, like names, but is like, what kind of energies and intentions are being brought to the body, brought to a play experience, brought to a social experience, and how a body is kind of understood and read and experienced. Because we can feel that. I mean, I don't, and I'm just speaking of me personally, I don't typically experience gender dysphoria specifically around like my genitals. It's more like, how are you relating to those parts? Do I see you? Do I feel that you are approaching my body from a place of, oh, I know what this is. And so I'm just going to do that thing that I do, that move. Or are you adapting with me? And we're writing our own erotic lexicon together.
One thing that struck me really forcefully about the book, and one thing that I think also allows you to be like quite theoretically daring at moments. Like I'm thinking, for instance, about one of the more on the face of it kind of counterintuitive claims that you make is like maybe safety is not the thing that we should be looking for, because if we center things on the now and we center things on pleasure that can be taken in the moment, rather than, tracing the history of like, oh, we used to call this thing gender identity disorder. Now we call it gender dysphoria. And how do we solve this? And I'm not saying that those are not, legitimate topics of concern, right? But there is this part where you're like, of course we are all shaped and brought into being by social forces that in many ways are militating against pleasure, right? And against positive experiences of the self and of the self in relation to others. But what if we thought about what you could do in the now? That to me, it just cuts through so many things. It doesn't require a sort of like distant horizon, a utopian horizon. Once we figured out like what is gender, what is sexual, hey, we solved it. Yeah. We figured it all out. But it's very, and I think it allows the book to be at once really like theoretically rigorous, but also just really kind and really attentive to people's needs in the moment, rather than sort of deferring questions of pleasure, of happy, good, experimental sex until some sort of problem has been navigated.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Abby's saying and what you've said and written, and it's that perspective and the way that you put it into practice is both so, I think, theoretically elegant, but also sort of audacious in these two ways.
Yeah,
and
that's a good word.
I think if I could just sort of repeat back to you in slightly different language what I've heard you saying and what I think Abby's pointing to as well, and this is something I deeply admire.
I'm really thinking out loud here.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
is that if we move beyond a narrow orientation that, as you say, is about diagnosing the individual site, like the client, the person who is experiencing this thing we call gender dysphoria, and take that as the necessitating like an orthopedic project, essentially, of fixing whatever their quote unquote problem is. And
who's the IP, who's the identified patient.
And above all, situating that as a type of like addressing a deficiency or some sort of failure to adapt or fit into some broader project, but instead do this twofold sort of movement where on the one hand, we take what we've previously labeled simply as a type of distress as actually not a deficiency or a quote unquote failure to fit in that is on them, but rather as a sort of a positive expression of a capacity or just something that isn't negative or an absence. And then simultaneously, theoretically, cut through all the kind of conceptual, developmental, uncritical, but like all these unnecessary spandrels of having to work backwards to vindicate as an unmarked norm, something that actually is marked and highly contingent. What that then opens up for us and clarifies is an ethically fraught but necessary encounter in the now between multiple people, and wherein multiple people can change. And that again, the audacity of that, I think, the urgency of that ramifies insofar as that it points to how, I think, for good reasons and for bad, but I think something that has to be addressed, people can be invested in like theory as being impermeable and eternal, and these structures of markedness that are actually presented as unmarked. And also just the idea even that even in like that clinical encounter, that the person doing the clinical work is somehow hygienically away from it, right? And that they can't change either. But instead, you're leaning into that capacity for change in a collaborative, open, risky mode.
Yeah, like I want to call on providers to take as many risks as you are asking the client to take, perhaps even more. And I think about what you were just saying, Patrick, about like the impermeability of theory, and I think about it's cognitive bias that I talk about in the book, functional fixedness, which is comes from a Gestalt therapist named Carl Dunker, and I think about like what we lose when something becomes reified, solidified. There's this quote from a very short story by Anam Sufi called Undone. And there's this passage at the end, this line that I think is just like gorgeous. And it's kind of like become this, I don't know, core value for me. And she writes, "Hold me like you would a photograph from the edges and lightly." And I love that. And I think that that's what I want to challenge folks to do, is to hold everything provisionally from the edges and lightly, which makes room for ambivalence. It makes room for uncertainty. It makes room for discomfort. It makes room for the unknown. And to kind of like bring back, it's this constant warping and weaving in the present between the past, our lineages, and dreaming a future. So it's not about like resolving a problem in the future. As you put it, Abby, it's about dreaming futures that have us in them, and that have us in them thriving. And we can only get that when we are not so like, when our tension is not so directed to grasping something so tightly that we're just so invested in it. The cathexis is just like overwhelming, in a sense. I really want, it's like the Heath Ledger's Joker. Why so serious? It's not that I don't think that these things aren't serious and that aren't felt, and that things aren't felt as deep pains sometimes by folks. Like I always want to make that move of understanding, like, I'm not trying to, say like, okay, well, this thing is crap. Don't use this word anymore. I really loathe in, like internet and social media, like pop therapy, and, like how it's like, say this, don't say this, and it's like, use whatever language you want, like if you want to use gender euphoria instead of gender pleasure because it's just the word that you reach for, fine. you know I just want folks to be aware of what's being called into the room, so that maybe there is some opportunity to see where our investment is and how much we want to continue to invest in that structure, in that construct.
So, Lucie, I feel like you are the perfect person for us to dive into talking about the 3 essays with, and rereading the 3 essays alongside Transsex really allowed me to see Freud with new eyes. And I want to say, to our listeners, just to like stipulate, you all know we're reading the standard edition, like slowly, like crawling through it. So we are going to do full justice at some point to the 3 essays. Today's conversation isn't an attempt to cover it or to be exhaustive or do justice to it. We couldn't do that in a single episode. So we're not trying to cover the 3 essays, but to return to them with Lucie, with an eye toward the question of what sorts of resources they might have for us today, as people, as clinicians, as teachers, people listening to this and people participating in this conversation, occupy a variety of these roles. But so to think with Lucie and Freud about what concepts like polymorphous perversity, fetishes, the distinction between sexual aim and sexual object, the narrative of how adult sexuality comes into being with, according to Freud, to look at all of these with an eye towards the text's limits and possibilities. So before we dive into that, Patrick, will you be history guy and do a brief intro to the book itself? I keep wanting to be like, to orient our listeners. But this whole book is
later.
But it's so much of this book is like, how do we get oriented? Do we?
All right. So I'll try and keep this very tight and short. The text, the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, appears in volume 7 of the standard edition and appeared in print in 1905. And so it, as Abby's indicated, it puts us sort of ahead of where we're going through steadily in the standard edition, although it also has some real continuities, whether it be these shout-outs to Fleece or these ideas that sort of one thing happens in one point in time and then later other things sort of retroactively make it more significant, etc. In any event, it's one of the texts that Freud, after its initial 1905 publication, returns to most of any of his others, layering on top of it footnote after footnote, and at least 4, if not 5 separate editions, and with footnotes that extend all the way up to 1915 and then 1920 in some instances. It's a very... So this text, which is on the one hand Freud's most fulsome articulation of a sexual theory, at least in terms of word count, is also not the last thing he has to say about it, and his thinking changes, even as he goes back to kind of alter or perceive in the earlier stuff he did traces or patterns for what comes later. This gets kind of meta and overdetermined, but as he himself writes in another paper, The Infantile Genital Organization in 1923, readers of my 3 essays on the theory of sexuality will be aware that I have never undertaken any thorough remodeling of that work in its later editions, but have retained the original arrangement and have kept abreast of advances made in our knowledge by means of interpolations and alterations in the text. In doing this, it may often have happened that what was old and what was more recent did not admit of being merged into an entirely uncontradictory whole. There's a lot going on even in that sentence, but these thematics of integrating successive developments or the capacity of things in the past to be changed or to become different in how they are expressed in the present kind of ramifies in terms of the themes of the text itself too. But clearly this text, as a stand-in or a synecdoche for the problem of sexuality for Freud, is also kind of a problem for him that he keeps returning to. 2 more things to say. The book is structured into those 3 essays, which respectively have the titles in English of Sexual Aberrations, Infantile Sexuality, and The Transformations of Puberty. And that kind of roughly maps on to accounts of adult, let's just use the term sort of amicably, of like the perversions, namely various adult dysfunctions or behaviors that are taken to be non-normative in adult sexuality, early development, and then whatever happens in after the period that he calls latency and puberty and thereafter. In terms of the reception, what's striking to note is that it's the second volume, or the second essay, the one on infantile development, which proves the most scandalous and provocative for readers. Some of that may be because a lot of the stuff covered in the first, which might be the one that we might think, oh, he's talking about all these strange behaviors that are, fetishism, etc., were actually already fairly familiar to his audiences and had been covered by figures in the early history of sexology, and you'd get these compendia via Krafft-Ebing and elsewhere. Yeah, and a whole genre of texts, some of which are more medical and some of which are more popular, titillating, or some combination thereof. But the thing that does seem to stick in the craw of the reading public to the present is this idea of infantile sexuality more generally, like the question of what does it mean even to talk about young kids as having this thing that we adults would call sexuality, or some sort of continuity between those states, which activates a whole ton of resistances. And that then brings me to what I might suggest, or I'm thinking in terms of the conversation we've already had and your fantastic work, Lucie, is this idea that perhaps, without falling into repeating some of the scandalized reactions of Freud's readers in 1905 or thereafter, where it's like, oh my God, how dare you say that thumb sucking is some sort of sexual style behavior, like the innocence of children, like heaven forfend. We could probably, at least initially, perceive some continuity between that reaction, namely thinking about kids as having something that then becomes, or through a series of changes becomes, what we now call, what we adults call, amongst ourselves, sexuality, and never the two shall meet, activates a much more radical and I think still current site of taboo for many people, and just a difficult thing to think about in general, which is namely the kind of contingencies and plasticity of both sexual development, looking backwards developmentally, but also in terms of the present, in terms of the givenness of this category of what we call sexuality as a coordination of bodies and desires and expressions and symptoms and aims and objects and all this other vocabulary. So yeah, that's my orienting roadmap there.
I want to read a passage from Lucie from Transex, from the new edition, which I think will help us get into this, and also just kind of provides a sort of like an attitudinal relationship to the text that is certainly one that I share. I mean, I find it so hard to like Freud in this text in a lot of ways. Quote, Freud often made radical claims and offered more than a few gorgeous conceptual innovations. It's just that he would sometimes follow up a brilliant and trenchant observation or theoretical provocation with a retreat from radicalism and assertions that are breathtaking in their conservatism and normativities. For instance, the assertion that the clitoral orgasm is immature or that anatomy is destiny. One of my favorite Freudian concepts is polymorphous perversity, close quote. So can we, the three of us, talk about what is also possibly the most fun to say Freudian phrase that there is, polymorphous perversity. It really rolls off the tongue. But like, talk about what it is for Freud, but also what it is for us, what the term means in the three essays, and also how we might want to put it to work in contemporary concepts. And Lucie, I want to see if you might start us off here, because it is a term that you'll use quite widely in transsex. Why is, after all of these years and given, all of the hedging about that we've all done in various ways about this text, why is polymorphous perversity still so good to think with?
I think, first of all, the way that it's important, to define what like Freud meant by perversion, for example, because that gets us to the first part of the radicalism of this, which is to say that he really defines perversion as anything that is a deviation from what the particular culture in which we're moving refers to as normal. And And that's a really important move. It's not saying that he's not saying that there is a normal and that, that a perversion is like, unlike, many of the sexologists and moral medical folks who preceded him, to say like, well, this is what normal is, and all this other stuff that we're observing in the clinic is wrong. And we've got to like find some way to account for it and get rid of it, basically. And it is inherently pathological. Freud is like, no, it's like, it's what he sees as the culture in which he's moving says that normal sexuality is X and that it's a deviation, but there's no kind of moral judgment around the deviation. It's just simply not what is sanctioned or normative. And I really, really think that that's such an important move, is that reference to the cultures in which we move. And then I can certainly take issue with even that notion of deviation. I tend to like Dorothy Allison's view on what perverse is, which she talks about in the foreword of My Dangerous Desires. And quote, it's perverse is to be disobedient to the rule of fear and hatred and shame, to seek one's own definitions and ideas, regardless of what others insist are the limits to what you may want or have. It radicalizes, Freud's notion, but like there's already some radical bit in there. And the polymorphous part is his recognition that, as he puts it, that our bodies, that there's a susceptibility to stimulus or a susceptibility to pleasure, which is, quote, possessed in a certain degree by the whole cutaneous surface. So anything is capable of being a conduit through which pleasure can pass or can happen. And so, like, then he talks, of course, about like the psychosexual stages of development, and and we're so familiar with those: the oral, the anal, the Oedipal, or the phallic, the latency period, and the genital period. And he likes to, like with so many developmental stage theories, like Erickson's. I think about Erickson, for example, and the psychosocial stages of development. But even there is built in this idea that pleasure is not just to be found in our genitals and in genitals behaving in a particular way, which is to say that it's about a phallus penetrating a front hole, and releasing seminal fluid, which then, results in conception, hopefully
of a male child.
Yeah, hopefully of a male child, a strong male child. And this is where he then, kind of retreats, into the conservatism, or like, oh God, I said something a little bit too much, and so I'm going to pull back, which leads him into all sorts of territory, hilarious things about like how, like, it's not just the way the zones, the erotogenic zones of the body, as he puts it, but or the zones through which pleasure can happen. But it's also like, he talks about like carriage rides and warm baths and trains and wrestling, and, as like these means of experiencing pleasure and stimulating the erotogenic zones. But what I think is just so gorgeous about that is that observation that we can experience pleasure in so many ways, and that pleasure, and in particular sexual pleasure, does not simply have to pass through the genitals or genitals behaving in particular ways. It can be, he acknowledges that, like, before, again, talking about the clitoris as an immature, like penis, that you have to like move out of, which, is like, this is where it gets into penis envy and, and that kind of stuff. But this idea that, like, yeah, the clitoris is this organ of pleasure, and he's recognizing that in a really powerful way. And not only that, but he's recognizing the anus, he's recognizing the mouth, he's recognizing just every surface of the skin. It's like, I sometimes, as a sex and kink educator, will teach classes on a technique called muffing, which involves the technical term is palpation of the inguinal canals. And I have, resources on that if, I don't want to get into it right now, but I think one of the things that I'm always trying to like point out with muffing, or really anything, is that, like, whether or not this is something that you want to do or can do, it introduces the possibility that there are so many other, I'll put it this way and crudely, there are so many holes you can fuck. Like, you'll never look at an armpit the same way, in a sense, and Freud is recognizing that, and he's not saying that they're terrible. He only, his realm of the pathological is really, really limited and very narrowly constructed.
Yeah. He says more or less explicitly, and then, walks it back in that classic kind of
Fort duh.
Yeah. But also this kind of weirdly, like, I don't want to say he's like edging on to like saying the thing or like doing some sort of like striptease in prose here, but there is this kind of.
But you're not saying
I'm
it.
not saying it. Yeah. He is articulate. He seems to basically say, like, the perversion isn't only a problem when these things that he calls perversions are only really problems when they become a problem for the person that's experiencing them, right? When they somehow produce some sort of dissatisfaction that is greater than whatever the pleasure of the activity might be, right? Or at least we could see parts of the essays where he does this. But more broadly, what I wanted to underscore in what you're saying, and just sort of gloss a term for people who are listening here, is to emphasize how this idea of like polymorphous perversity as like an initial state developmentally, but also
initial is important here. This is where we all start.
It sort of translates into, or could be paraphrased as, like, the human starts out with, and possibly can continue to have, an equipotential developmental capacity for cultivating pleasure, or for building ways of finding pleasure. And in that sense, it's a feature of why Freud uses this language of psychosexuality as opposed to just sort of sexuality tout court. And while I understand that there are many, amazing things that happen among the birds and the bees, right? There is, in the animal kingdom, something that I think, and I don't think it's just us looking at animal life from the outside, that doesn't quite map on to the full complexity or the potential pathways of this stuff that we call human sexual behavior, insofar as that, I don't know, like, even as we do have these biological, like puberty, menopause, all the other things that Freud will invoke in different ways in his work, where different things happen in the body as a matter of sort of some kind of apparently biological necessity, we don't have moments where we suddenly molt, right? Or we just go into this immediate period of like estrus, and then suddenly, boom, all the sex happens. Instead, I'm trying to think, like, bees don't muff, right? There is this kind of way in which whatever people do and seek with themselves, with one another over time, is happening in the space of this thing that he calls the psyche, right? Which is this interface between like the biological body as a source of instinctual drives, as a site of nervous system stimulation, as a germ layer or whatever, and the experience, like the arena of the experiencing person, as more than the sum of their experiences over time. And that is just a remarkable thing. I think just the orientation to that, to make it a psychosexuality, and then to admit of the possibility, you know, as we've already, you know, people following us in the standard edition will know that like the psyche is capable of injury, of development that's something other just than, you know, like a very linear stagism. And I get hung up on the stagism too, right? I have a very hard time following it. This is why like certain types of Hegelianism and Marxism also break my brain in a similar way. Like getting from one stage to another, just, I can't do it. But what I think the key thing here is the fact that stages can, we toggle between things. Things come back. We find new things. Experiences open us up and change where we go.
I mean, I think you're getting to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but whatever. It's my podcast too. You know,
sorry, I didn't mean to.
If I want to break, no, I'm just going to say if I want to break my outline, I can. That's what I meant, sweetie. Not.
I didn't mean to.
You know, one of the things that always strikes me, because it's such a weird book. Let me just say, it is such a weird book, and I want, because of my own commitments, let's say my own political commitments, I want to look at this text and be like, we can like, and kind of celebrate polymorphous perversity in some ways, right? And be like, we can find pleasure everywhere. And, you know, what Patrick's talking about, you know, it breaks your brain partly because some of the point is it's so fucking hard to arrive at quote unquote normal adult sexuality that it's a miracle that anybody does. And I am in fact quoting, you know, I'm air quoting around normal. Like normal does a lot of heavy lifting in this book. But I actually tend, especially in my more charitable to Freud moments, to really draw on somebody like Juliet Mitchell in Feminism and Psychoanalysis to be like, no, he's being descriptive, not normative. And you should understand normal in that sense. But it's a miracle that anyone especially that any woman, according to Freud, ever becomes a straight adult. I mean, there is a real question. And here, you know, I think about this, and when I think about Adrienne Rich and her essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And if everyone starts out with the mother as the first love object, you know, she really poses this question, which is latent in Freud. Why would anyone ever be sexually attracted to a man? Like the amount of contortions that you have to go through on this unbelievably circuitous path is just, it's so elaborate. It's amazing. But I also want to say, and this is the part where, you know, I do find this is not my favorite part of Freud, because polymorphous perversity gets its most full treatment in this book, talking about, you know, in the context of the seduction hypothesis, in terms of talking about what happens to children who have been molested, that, you know, children who are the victims of sexual assault will tend to go in these sorts of, you know, quote unquote non-standard directions, or that it's like, oh, hey, lots of women who are prostitutes or who might have the ability or temperament to become prostitutes. And he doesn't mean prostitutes in like a very, you know, friendly, you know, sex work is work kind of way. Like he doesn't. No. Like, let's just be really clear about that. You know, he's just like, well, polymorphous perversity works so nicely there because it lets them kind of enjoy all of these things. So it cuts both ways, right? There is both this capacity, I think, for us to read this text and be like, he's talking about fleece and, you know, bisexuality as being essentially, you know, where everybody starts. He's talking about our capacity to find anything an erogenous zone, but also it is associated with something, no matter how much you want to work to make this descriptive rather than normative, something that we should overcome.
Yeah. And that, I think, really, that where it slips into the really hard into the normative rather than the descriptive. I think I love that distinction. And is really in the third essay.
Yes.
Where he's talking about how the route through which women's sexuality develops, and that's where he gets into that abandonment. Like, if you're a mature woman, like you will abandon this fanciful attachment that you have to your clitoris.
Right, exactly.
It's like sawdust.
Hard
to
pass
start a fire.
on that one.
Yeah.
But this is where I think we really can, and I love the way you do this, Lucie, is like you can read Freud against Freud. You don't have to adopt in a blanket fashion everything he says in order to recuperate this concept and be like, this is a great way to think about human sexuality. We don't have to then follow him along this sort of variegated path that says every turnoff is a bad thing. We can actually, and I think this is going to take us nicely to our next question, because I really want to talk about fetish and kink, is we can be like, all of those points that Freud thinks are like, oh, you're accidentally taking that exit when you're supposed to be taking like the long path to like quote unquote mature adult heterosexuality. What if we lingered there and it was rad?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is really thinking of it in a contemporary frame, and not so much in Freud, but I think the implications of polymorphous perversity is like, what can open up for us? Like, what does this, in fact, give us permission to do? Or like, what wheels start turning? What ideas start forming? What dreams start getting dreamed, or reveries? And I think about it like, if I just think about it in terms of like this male sexuality and the focus on like hard penises penetrating things, and it's like, what if you experience, premature orgasm? What if you experience, if you can't gain or hold an erection? Like, the normative, would say like, well, then you are a failure. Like, in fact, like there's this body of work in research psychology about like precarious manhood, and so like it makes manhood contingent on this performance of a part, and then like, what happens when it's like, so you have a flaccid penis? Great. Like, we can still have fun. Like, we can either just like not involve it at all, or like the nerve endings are still there. Like, it's erectile potential is there in order to just kind of stretch it out and make it more accessible. It's not that the nerves suddenly go away. And so I like to think about that, like, what is the gift of polymorphous perversity for all of us, whether we're cis or trans? Is like, what does it allow us to just like reach for in terms of pleasure, so that it doesn't have to be one thing and one thing only?
It's so hard to it's hard to conceptualize and talk about. I find, because one is, I think Abby is indicated, right? The idea of the person as being plastic, or are having this capacity to self-express or to find new pleasures or to learn new things about ourselves, it can go in dark and grim directions, right? If a person's sexuality is fundamentally plastic, well, that could be a warrant for, I don't know, like some sort of horrifying like therapy in which we try to force people into some sort of orientation that they don't want to have, right? This is that could be warranted by that too. And I think that's a danger.
I mean, somehow we're talking about conversion therapy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it can ramify in relation to other types of social expressions and gendered formations that are, I think pretty grim too. I don't recall what the line item in like the U.S. military budget is for like quote unquote erectile dysfunction drugs, but it's a lot, and it's a lot more oftentimes than they've spent on doing counseling, at least in terms of attention, right? What I'm trying to push at though, and I think this is conceptually difficult, but also activates some of the same like resistances that are present or that were present in Freud's era and the reaction to even this phrase of infantile sexuality is this felt desire, even when we kind of know better and our experience is undermine it, for sexuality to be given, right? It to be a one and done thing. We know what the point is. We know where we stand. It's just there. It's an easily identifiable fixed state, right? And I think that's for many reasons imposed on people, right? It has a lot to do with anxieties. It has a lot to do with like social reproduction and the forces of capitalism, et cetera. But it forces a whole bunch of contortions on us conceptually. It forces a whole bunch of foreclosures of experience because that doesn't reflect our being in time in relation to one another. And Abby's used a bunch of analogies or metaphorical language about like the detours or the turnoffs. And I keep on thinking, for whatever reason, maybe this is my own sort of like object fetishism, death drive orientation here, but I keep thinking about like driving, right? Where like we all know that like you don't like turn 16 and suddenly know how to fucking drive. Right?
Yeah.
There isn't like a car waiting for you with a bow on it in the driveway and it's yours and you take driver's ed, right? You also play with little toy cars. Hell, like I know people who've toilet trained their kids by giving them little old like Matchbox cars that you can buy by like, the shoebox. It's a great way to get a kid to control their belt. But somehow, despite that, and also kids they ride in cars. They know what cars do. They have some sense about how adults drive, right? And yet sexuality, which adults surround with taboos, which kids have questions about, and we don't necessarily answer them with, we debate over sex ed, et cetera, is still taken to be or proposed as it's a given thing. You should just know it. It should be straightforward. And if you don't have that clarity, then there's something wrong with you.
Gail Rubin calls it the assumption of sexual essentialism.
Yeah.
The idea that sex is this thing that is transhistorical and transcultural. And, I'm a Francophile and, and I love that. But, I think I'm struck sometimes by how like pervasive sexual essentialism is. It's this, like there's really not, a fully developed sex education program in the way that there can be in the US and Canada, although increasingly less in the US. Because there's this idea that, well, sex is natural. You should just know how to do it from the, and it's like, how does that happen?
Yeah, I think it mirror back to you too, and I think this bears on the question of like vulnerability and of how we relate to what is or isn't sexual or can be entertained in terms of sexual encounters between adults. The corollary to that attitude is that a lot of things happen that overwhelm and harm people and that are not assimilable or felt to be legible or communicable by the people that they happen to. And that later there's a kind of disavowal or an ick factor, rightly for some good reasons, but also for reasons I think that are harmful, to think about those experiences in relation to what we want or want to work through in the present as adults. I think here about Avi and Anne's work about sexual trauma and the ways in which how saying that experiences of being overwhelmed, of being victimized, et cetera, are not that there is a a problem or some sort of disavowal that happens in denying that could have some sort of impact, and not just a negative impact, on what a person later would want to think through or how they might want to behave.
There's a line that I think is just so interesting early on in the 3 essays where Freud says, and this is in the middle of his discussion of fetishism, right? Like, what is a fetish? Where he says a certain degree of fetishism is thus habitually present in normal love. And it's, it's in the midst of this discussion. And, I think this gets us back to our sort of like, is he being descriptive? Is he being normative? Is, sometimes column A, sometimes column B, sometimes a little bit of both, because he is certainly thinking about, pathology. But here I go back also to the idea of like the road not taken, or at least to the road metaphor, because I actually can't think about this text without thinking about it in terms of that metaphor, or at least the path that we don't have to be in a car. Thinking about going very fast on the Autobahn. But so much of what's going on in the 3 essays is about the question of like, how do you even get a sexual orientation, right? How do you get sexually oriented? One of the things I've always found to be so radical, actually, in ways that I really appreciate about this text is how it really makes it just crystalline, just so clear how much heterosexuality is an achievement. And I don't necessarily mean that it's like something that we should give a lot of applause to, although we do, right? Patrick, I'm thinking about... Can I tell a story for a second?
Sure.
When Patrick and I got engaged, at a certain point, my mother called and was like, "Oh, it's going to be the holidays. I want to get you guys a KitchenAid." And I ran into the other room and I said, "Great news. We don't have to get married." Because we're getting a KitchenAid. And he looked at me with such horror. Right? Like, wait, is the wedding really off? And I was like, no, but one of the things that you find out as a straight person when you get straight married is that people love to celebrate heterosexuality. Like, when I got a PhD, nobody gave me a KitchenAid. Like, well, we do this, but Freud shows you the ways that heterosexuality is not just this achievement that we, culturally like rain down plaudits on people for doing in public, but that it's so hard to get there. Like, it's not our kind of quote unquote natural state, right? It requires this lengthy, circuitous path to arrive at. There's so many detours you can make along the way. So much of what goes under the name of those sorts of like detours or like, divergences from the path that will lead you to heterosexuality, is what he would call a fetish. And I'm hoping we can spend a little bit of time on that, especially because, we have you, a person who among your many hats, you count being a kink educator. We can talk about like what a fetish is in the 3 essays and how it does and doesn't map onto ways that we might want to talk about kink and fetishes now in the spirit of your book.
I love that I get to talk about fetishes and kink and the, which allows me to bring in some of the wisdom of some professional dominance. But again, I think, kind of back us up, he makes this distinction between sexual aim and sexual object.
Yes.
The act towards the sexual instinct tends is the sexual aim, and the person from whom sexual attraction proceeds is the sexual object. So, and it's kind of torturous the way that he talks about this, but like,
it's so hard to track. Yeah.
So, yeah, to go back to kind of what perversions are the deviations, and a deviation isn't necessarily a bad thing or pathological. He defines perversions in particular as deviations from the normal sexual aim, which either A, quote, extend in an anatomical sense beyond the regions of the body that are designed for sexual union, or B, linger over the intermediate relations to the sexual object, which should be normally be traversed rapidly on the path towards the final sexual aim. So, our path, our Autobahn, as it were. And
we're going to call this episode Sexual Autobahn, just so you know.
Oh,
no, I'm
please.
kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, no. And so, but for Freud, the pathological character in a perversion is found not in the, quote, content of the new sexual aim, but in the relation to the normal, which he specifies is like, if a perversion is happening alongside, that it's just like it's part of the menu, then it's okay, not pathological. However, if it is marked by exclusiveness and fixation, that marks it off as pathological.
The main course.
Yeah. What's interesting in part is that, so that's the fetish. The fetish is when something is exclusive and fixated upon. And if we're getting technical, like contemporary parlance would distinguish between a fetish, a partialism, and a kink. A fetish being about objects or, things. So like it's about hosiery, for example, versus a partialism, which is about a body part. So like what we sometimes refer to as a foot fetish or, something like that. This is where I bring in the wisdom of professional dominance, because how they will often think about the difference between like what we would refer to as a kink versus a fetish is non-pathologically the exclusiveness and the fixation. That a kink, like you can have a foot kink, which is just like, I like involving feet. I'm into feet, versus I am partial to feet. I have a foot fetish, which is to say I cannot engage in anything that I would refer to as sex without the inclusion of feet. So there's a remainder of Freud in how we like think about the typology of this sexologically. But what drops out is the normative value, where he is ascribing a particular, that exclusiveness and fixation is a problem. It's just simply like, it's only a problem if there's like a mismatch and like, you're playing with somebody who is just like not in the feet, and, and you are really into it, it's essential, then it's probably you're not going to be a good match, but it's not pathological.
The question of like, where is the problem manifesting and who or what is the problem a problem for seems so relevant here, because on the one hand, and this is where I think we can point to a tension, generative in many cases with Freud, but here I think he kind of gets a little, he trips over his own feet, so to speak.
I see what you did there.
Thank you. Between trying to account for a theoretical problem or a scientific problem, and the problem that he is dealing with qua problems in living as a clinician, right? And vis-a-vis the language of object and aim, and also kind of lingering behind that is this idea of like the source of the instinct behind those things, or that takes those expressions, is a fundamentally Darwinian style biological preoccupation with trying to account for sexuality qua drive, right? Or like a biological urgency to do something. And if we were to think about that, in relation to other types of drives or on the level of that abstraction, we'd be like, okay, well, if someone has I don't know, I have the source of my stomach feeling very weird, or like I'm starting to get a little bit hangry. That's my hunger drive, right? I'm hungry now, so I have to find an object, and that object is going to be, I don't know, a hamburger, and I'm going to eat that hamburger, and then the aim of that is satiety, and I'm no longer hungry, right? That seems to be what on one level he wants to articulate as the paradigm, right? But as actually Laplanche and Pontellier kind of note very delightfully in their own little coy line here, if one sets out with the commonly held view that defines sexuality as an instinct in the sense of a predetermined behavior typifying the species and having a relatively fixed object, parentheses, partner of the opposite sex, and aim, parentheses, union of the genital organs in coitus, close parentheses, it soon becomes apparent that this approach can only provide a very inadequate account of the facts that emerge as much from direct observation as from psychoanalysis. And this then points to the other much more lived human dimension of the problem. And the problem is like or what is or isn't a problem when it comes to the actual realities of psychosexuality, which is that the coordination of objects and aims, it's not that straightforward for people. And the problem isn't on the level of like accounting for like how I'm going to live out my Darwinian need to replicate the species simply.
Yeah. And once you take that out of the mix, there's a passage that I really wanted to make sure that we read. And this is from the towards the end of the book, actually, in a section that I am not making this up, is entitled "Dangers of Forepleasure." And this is in this section. I know. This is in the section where we've gotten to, Freud has kind of taken us through the path of like, what would this look like if, women have shifted from their pesky, desire to have pleasure from the clitoris and moved that to the vagina. Men are interested in, the ejaculation gets to be quite important here. And so here's what he says. The connection between forepleasure and infantile sexual life is, however, made clearer by the pathogenic part which it can come to play. The attainment of the normal sexual aim can clearly be endangered by the mechanism in which forepleasure is involved. This danger arises if at any point in the preparatory sexual processes, the forepleasure turns out to be too great and the element of tension too small. The motive for proceeding further with the sexual process then disappears. The whole path is cut short, and the preparatory act in question takes the place of the normal sexual aim. And if you go a little further down in the passage, he says, such is in fact the mechanism of many perversions, which consist in a lingering over the preparatory acts of the sexual process. Close quote. Which first, wow. But there is this kind of, what if you had too much pleasure, but it wasn't the right kind? I mean, if you take reproduction out of it, there is this kind of like, I don't see the problem.
Well, it's the T.H.L. Mencken line, someone's getting away with something, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like he almost knows that, but not quite, because there is this distinction between two different types of pleasure. The pleasure that is honestly the pleasure of polymorphous perversity, right? Which could go on forever, which could happen in all, which is ateleological fundamentally, right? And then there's the teleological pleasure, which is, involved in what he's thinking about as like quote unquote normal sexual aim.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that so much of your book is about this whole, what if we take this incredibly expansive, capacious approach to pleasure, and instead of being like, this thing is infantile and needs to get replaced by the quote unquote normal adult way of doing things, what if we were like, this sounds great?
May I interest you in queer sex? It's like, yeah, it's traveling around, let me spread the good word, about it.
Have you heard the good news?
Have you heard the good news about literal orgasm. I mean, again, we've been talking about this, a lot in our conversation, the ways that on the one hand, what he is ascribing as normal is actually variation. And then when he's retreating from that because, we can't enjoy queer sex that much. It's kind of like, and we can talk about what this is, but it's kind of like when the folks who kind of came up with inversion theory, or extended kind of like Karl Ulrich's idea of the earning into, the inversion theory, the sexological inversion theory that Freud references in the first essay. It's like they talk about like the invert it's the soul of one gender in the body of another, and there's this moment where it's like they're almost wanting to they're so desperate to preserve heterosexuality because it's like, okay, well, the soul of the female soul is attracted to the male soul. It just so happens that they both look like men. And they never really extend the logic of like, well, okay, but what if they're both have a female soul? Okay, so then you've lost the whole to use what you said earlier, Patrick, as a play on words. It's no longer straightforward.
Lucie, one of the things we love so much about our listeners is that they're always asking us for reading recommendations. So we have touched on so many things today, and your book is so rich. For people who are interested in today's conversation, in addition, of course, to the new edition of Transsex, which I will link to in the show notes, what are a few texts you might recommend that they read?
I love this question. Obviously, a big touchstone for me is Avgi's Sexuality Beyond Consent. It's one of the most gorgeous and dense and hard and disturbing and seductive books that I think I've read in the last 10 years. It's amazing. And I'm so indebted to it because, it gave me so much permission in the second edition to like think about how it's okay to not understand everything. You sometimes feeling is more important than understanding a thing. And I really appreciate so many facets of that book, but especially that. I also like two huge touchstones for me are Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz.
It's wonderful.
I think that there's like in the queer theory camp, there's, you're either like Munoz utopist or you're an Edelman pessimist in a sense. And I'm definitely in that kind of, Munoz futurity camp. And then alongside that, the activist and author and filmmaker, artist, Tourmaline, she just came out with a gorgeous new book about Marsha P. Johnson. And it's really, really good. And what I love about Tourmaline's writing, she has this gorgeous essay from like July 2020 in Vogue called, it's about freedom dreaming. And read alongside Munoz is like, it's a gorgeous pairing. Like, I love her fierce commitment to the idea that the world of abundance and pleasure and softness is not something far away.
Mm-hmm.
To kind of reference something you had noted earlier, Abby, like it's not something that's far away, but it's always already here. So I love that. And then, lastly, the book Hatred of Sex by Tim Davis and Oliver Dean. Again, a very dense book. You really have to want it with the political theory. I rarely do want it with political theory, but I did want it with this book, and particularly their first chapter on queer theory and kind of the queer theory and the hatred of sex. But also, like, I love anybody who's engaging in a takedown of attachment theory. Like I popped popcorn on y'all's episode on attachment theory and boundaries. Like I was just like eating that up, and go, take it down. Yeah.
I want to also, I'm a nerd's nerd. I do read the footnotes. And so I did spend a little time in the footnotes of transsex to be like, who's she thinking with? And there are so many writers that I love and teach, but there's one that I just wanted to shout out who you cite. And this is a classic essay, is Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic, as power. Yeah. And I do feel like, there's a line, this is from, I don't have it in front of me. So if I get this wrong, that's me, not Audre Lorde. But there's this line in this, just gorgeous essay about reimagining the erotic as something that is just this incredibly capacious category. And she talks about how there's no difference in kind for her between writing a poem and moving against the body of a woman she loves. And there's something about that spirit that seems to me to be about polymorphous perversity in a really lovely way. All of which is to say, we loved the book. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah. Well, on social media, Instagram and Blue Sky, I'm at Sex Beyond Binaries, at least until Meta decides to kick us off. And then, my website, luciefielding.com. I'm trying to be everywhere, and I want to meet people. And, another thing that I really love about Freud and the 3 essays is precisely something you highlighted, Patrick, which was, that it's iterative. And I think so iteratively, and I think so much in conversation with folks. I don't want writing to be a solitary practice. I want it to be something about the conversation and the encounter and what happens when those encounters are generative and felicitous, and to use a beyond term, an emotional storm. So I really hope to see folks as I'm on the road and as I'm teaching. Teaching is, as Spock would say, my first best destiny. And I love doing it.
Oh, this has been such a pleasure.
Truly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lucie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported, made possible, and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, please come find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Lucie Fielding. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.